record, and yeah, I think we'll just get underway, Jamie. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Powered by Positive on this Tuesday afternoon. I'm delighted today to be joined by Jamie Cooke, who is the head of RSA in Scotland. Jamie, welcome to Powered by Positive.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's very exciting.
Jamie, as well as being the head of the RSA in Scotland, I'll ask you in a moment, perhaps just for those who don't know about the RSA, to perhaps give a little bit of an introduction to RSA. But Jamie is also an advocate, perhaps even goes far as to say an activist in the area of basic income, certainly a thought leader. And you know, I think the first time I came across you talking about basic income was at TEDx Glasgow. I think that was 2017. And that really was it's been embedded in my consciousness since then. So I'm really pleased that you've taken time out of what I know is a busy schedule to spend some time with us this lunchtime. So thank you, Jamie. If let's go back a moment to RSA, the Royal Society of Arts, Manufacturers and Commerce. Have I got that bit right? Yeah. Yes. So for those who don't know, could you perhaps explain a bit about RSA?
No problem. So yes, it's the Royal Society for the Encouragement of the Arts, Manufacture and Commerce, which is an incredibly long-winded name, really for an organisation that's interested in people and in ideas and in how you bring the two together to change the world. And I think that's really been part of our ethos throughout our history. So we're quite an old organisation, founded back in 1754, very much rooted in the Enlightenment thinking of the time, and particularly the Scottish Enlightenment. So for me, you know, leading on Scottish activity, it's been a consistent part of our legacy and our history, whether that be from early days with, you know, thinkers like Adam Smith, who were members of the society, through to the present day. And I suppose there were three things when we were set out the organisation as being a bit different, because it was a time when there were a lot of these coffee house societies opening up, and the RSA was founded in a coffee house in Covent Garden in London. And I think there were three critical aspects I think are important for us in our mission today. So one is that we were always intended to be open to everybody. So at the very first meeting, apparently there was one of the gentlemen, I'll use the term loosely, present, who suggested it should be a male-only establishment. Thankfully, he was very swiftly put in his place by the women who were present. And so from the beginning, the organisation was open to men and women and to anybody who was interested. And that was an important difference from several of the organisations around at the time. The second part was that we were always globally focused. So although throughout our history, being based in London, you know, we were tied into, I suppose, a lot of kind of British expats around the world for a long part of our history, but we were always global. Our first non-UK fellow was Benjamin Franklin in the US. And from that, it's ensured that vision has always tried to connect into a global community. And today, we have over 30,000 fellows around the world, really active presence in the US, Canada, across Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere. I think the final part that was critical for us was, although it was a collection of the great and the good, these were people with money and prestige and power. What was different was they thought they had ideas about what might be wrong or what the opportunities in society might be, but they didn't think they had the solutions. What they felt they had was the capacity to support and facilitate solutions, creative solutions. And so they looked to the wider population to actually answer the great challenges of our times. And we did this in the beginning through what they call premiums. So these were public competitions where they would set usually a financial prize to solve a problem. The first one was for a crop called madder that was used as a dye in the cotton industry, had never been grown in the UK en masse. They set a prize and said, if you can grow it in UK soil, we'll give you some money. A couple of guys did so in England. That then led to a massive impact on the cotton industry, particularly in the northwest of England, around Manchester, and a major driver for the Industrial Revolution and a lot that came out of it. And so a lot of that early focus was on that idea of these premiums. So whether it be a machine that was invented to clean chimneys so that children didn't have to anymore and help lead to the abolition of child poverty. The mutiny and the bounty was caused by the RSA indirectly. Captain Bligh was trying to win a premium for delivering breadfruit. Pushed his crew a bit too hard.
No idea.
Mutinied, threw him overboard. What I love about it is if I ever get a chance to retire, my retirement book is going to be about the fact that he survived, made it back to London, hired a new crew, and won the premium with his new crew. So in terms of learning, leadership in a time of mutiny. And I think for us today, that's very much what we continue to want to see. How do we tap into this incredible network of fellows? Our fellows come from every imaginable background, discipline, yourself included, who bring such a wealth of different ideas. I remember talking to one of our fellows who said the only profession she'd never come into contact with as a fellow was an undertaker. So I've always been, we need to bring an undertaker into the fellowship. But actually, we have one of Scotland's leading anatomists as a fellow, for example. So we got ourselves at least into the business of dead bodies. But it's by bringing together those different ideas, the networks that our fellows bring, that we look to try and enhance and contribute. And I think that's an incredibly relevant space. But it's not one we fill on our own. And one of the things I love about the RSA, and I've been here over 10 and a half years now, I'm a fellow as well as a staff member, is that we tend not to be precious. And so it's a great space to collaborate with others to hopefully a lot of the time not reinvent the wheel and add value to what great people are already doing. But where there is space, we mentioned basic income, where perhaps there was a bit of a gap, then we can step into that breach as well and hopefully bring those enlightenment values updated, because they had their challenges and their historical kind of backgrounds that we might not want for today, but those principles that we can bring into the modern world.
Thank you so much for sharing that background. One of my delights during the summer, Jamie, when we had our few weeks of sunshine in lockdown, and it was not long after I became a fellow, but I got myself a copy of Anton Howe's book that he published this year about the history of the RSA, and actually sitting on the decking in the garden in the sunshine with a cup of tea and just reading a chapter at lunchtime. It was lovely to escape from everything else that was going on in the outside world, and very proud to have become a fellow this year. I think just before we move on to talk about basic income, one of the things that has really impressed me, and I've talked about it when we've held these sessions previously with the RSA this year, is how you've responded to the situation. And I think almost from the get-go of lockdown, you as an organisation were adapting and were creating events, and the podcast I think became a weekly. It was something I really looked forward to, and those 30-minute, 40-minute conversations that Matthew generally held, and actually produced by a client of ours, Craig Templeton Smith. A real moment of pride for us as Ashton McGill listening to those. But I think that perhaps exemplifies the organisation, that this here was an issue, here was a challenge, here's a crisis. How do we react to that? And you continue to put on great events and have done throughout the whole of the last 9 months.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think at the end of the day, for an organisation like ours, in a sense, what's the point of us if we can't be of use during a huge crisis, but also, without for a second downplaying the human cost that has come out of this pandemic. There are also, as we'll discuss, opportunities to change narrative around the politics and the economy and society, and I think it's critical that we find those spaces. And as you say, I think both what we've produced centrally, so the podcast, some of the Thursday lunchtime sessions we were doing, I was able to host a couple of those, including Catherine Trebek from great work here in Scotland. But also, I mean, even for us in RSA Scotland, we've been very much committed to keeping our programme going during this period. And it's been phenomenal, the response. So I think so far over the kind of since the pandemic started, I think we're over 3,000 people, participating and registering for RSA Scotland events. The same period normally would be a fraction of that, with in-person events. A chance to engage with thinkers from around the world, because we don't have to fly them over or find time in their diary. They can find that space, and also to engage with interested people. So each event we've held, we've both been able to engage with people in Scotland who wouldn't normally attend. So our annual conference earlier this year, normally we'd get maybe 70, 80 people. We've rotated it between Glasgow and Edinburgh. This year, I think we had 250 registered. And we had people from the islands who, of course, can't normally attend. And so I think what it's showing us is that, hopefully as we start to move past COVID and we're able to get back to in-person events, we will, of course, look to have those. I think it's really important to have that. There's a reason, there's lots of reasons, but for me, there's a critical reason we're a fellowship rather than just a membership. It's about that connectivity to each other, not just to the organisation. So we want those in-person events, but we're also committed to ensuring that this online space can continue, because we can record our events as you've been doing, so we can use that as an archive, and we can connect with fantastic partners around the world, both within the RSA, so particularly our affiliates in RSA US and RSA Oceania, where we've got some really interesting stuff developing, hopefully in the new year. But also, yeah, with other thinkers. And I think it's forced us to prioritize what we think is important, but also has really seen that response from fellows. So, you know, when we saw the economic crash in 2008, the fellowship numbers dropped, quite understandably, because people were in financial challenges. They had to prioritize their spending. During this crisis, and I know we're still going through it, but if anything, numbers have certainly held steady, and if anything, have started to rise because people really want to engage and are, as you say, taking that time that's been forced upon them to engage with ideas. And if we can find a way to sustain that, not just, I don't just mean from an RSA perspective, but from a societal perspective, that could be a game changer in terms of how we engage with each other.
And just before we move on to the main topic for today, I'll just mention a couple of events that you have coming up, that the RSA have coming up. There's this Thursday, it looks like a fascinating hour at lunchtime at 1 o'clock, Design's Response to the Crisis of 2020, which I'm really looking forward to. Signed up for that one. And then next Tuesday, I think we've got two events next Tuesday. There's a Scotland Engage event, and then there's also a tribute to Sir Ken Robinson, who's a fantastic thinker, speaker, and you know, I'm going to try and figure out how I can do both of those events, and one might have to be watched back on record later. But hey, I would rather have lots of events than not have any. So you know, a huge thank you to you and the team for all that you've done this year.
No, absolutely. And I mean, we've got a really interesting event tomorrow that's not really been out as much in public, but certainly has been sent out to fellows around, and very interesting if anyone wants to get in touch who's interested about looking at the relationship between Germany and Scotland. And so I think a key part for us, the RSA is that we're a politically neutral organisation in terms of party politics and in terms of constitutional questions, Brexit, independence, and so on. And I think that's really important in the sense of, it recognises the diversity of our fellowship's views, but also can allow us to play a safe space to actually start to explore some of these issues in greater detail. And so one of the things we're very keen to explore over coming months, we had an event recently with the US Consulate looking at American federalism and what that could mean for Scotland and the UK. So over the coming months, we're going to be looking at a lot about that relationship of Scotland with the rest of the world that I think is so critical just now and has an impact across civic society, business, you know, academia and political life. I think, yeah, the more we can start to push that, the better.
Great. Folks, if you're interested in finding out more about these, take a look at RSA events on Twitter, RSA or RSA themselves, and also Ashton Gill will share some of those links too. Jamie, I'm really keen for us to move the conversation forward now into the area of basic income. I know it's a topic that's very dear to your heart, and that for many of us, and certainly in the Ashton McGill team, it's something we've been talking more and more about over the past few months. But for anyone who doesn't understand or doesn't know, hasn't perhaps heard of basic income, but their attention has been piqued a little, could you perhaps just explain what we mean by basic income?
Absolutely. So yeah, it's a very old idea, but one that seems to really find a resonance in the world we're in. And I think maybe in a minute I'll talk through where we've seen some of that kind of progress. But fundamentally, it's the idea that every eligible person receives a regular payment from the state directly to them as an individual that they're able to choose to use in whichever way they see fit. So there's certain core conditions that are expected. So it's universal, it's unconditional, and it's regular and secure and targeted. So the regular and secure is that you know it'll be there every month. So you can plan on the basis, or you know, it could be at different frequencies, but monthly I think usually is kind of the standard. You expect, you know, it's going to arrive on a certain date in your bank account. You can choose to plan on that basis. It will be there every month in perpetuity to you as an individual. That's critical. It's universal, so everybody receives this, which maybe it gives us one of the kind of critiques that we can kind of explore later on. But it means that there's no means testing. There's no judging your place in society on the basis of the financial resources that you have access to, or the employment that you have, or the income that you bring in. It says that every single one of us, by the very status of our eligibility within that community, receive that as our right. And I think that's critical because it starts to move against a lot of what we've seen change in social security in recent years. And finally, it's unconditional. And one of the biggest changes we've seen in the social security system is that impact of, you know, the sanctions, the conditionality that's been brought into the system. You must be proving you're looking for work 35 hours a week before you can even consider claiming and so on. This is unconditional. You can use it however you see fit, on whatever you see fit. It is your money to make use of. And therefore, that gives you that freedom and opportunity to make choices with it. So it's this payment that comes directly to you. It's not paid to a head of household. So it's paid individually to each adult. Most models, so for example, model we've produced at the RSA, children would receive a basic income, usually at a slightly lower level, and that would be paid to their main caregiver until they reached, presumably in Scotland, the age of 16. Most cases, the presumption being the mum. And then for those of pension age, effectively you get a universal basic pension, which means that it would be at a higher rate than the standard universal basic income, but wouldn't have some of the elements of the current system, which have obviously, particularly through the WASPy campaign, we've seen have punished particularly women who have had that time out of the contributionary aspects of it.
I mean, Jimmy, this sounds eminently sensible. Why isn't this the norm?
So I think there's a number of reasons for it. I think some of the critiques that have been there before that existed over time are very deeply rooted in a lot of our thinking. So one of the immediate critiques you receive about it is that everybody will be lazy. If you give people money for nothing, and I mean, apart from anything, the concept is money for nothing. It's our money. It's paid into the system and coming back to us. In the US, they quite often, given the very different political context, quite often talk about it as a dividend that you're receiving from society rather than a income, if you like, because of that concept of it maybe being unearned, if you like. But this idea of laziness, we have a very strong tradition across most of certainly the Western world, and I think here in Scotland with our strong Calvinistic heritage and kind of cultural norms, this idea that you have to earn something, that it's actually giving people money without expecting something in return, will lead to idleness and laziness. And I think that's been quite a strong cultural barrier to some of the concepts, and particularly maybe at a time where the prevailing expectation in society was that work was the best route out of poverty, that jobs for life still existed, that if you worked hard enough, you would do better for yourself. So why would you give this money out of nothing? Now, apart from anything, the evidence around the world from any sort of system that has trialed using direct payments to people has demonstrated that it doesn't lead to laziness. Apart from anything, the systems that are usually being proposed are not of significantly high levels. They are basic in every sense of the word. But also people want to have impact in life. People want to do things in their lives. Actually, a lot of the time it's the current system that creates this idleness because it forces you into that trap of not being able to leave the current system. And actually, if you give people a security, you empower them to have more of an impact than perhaps they would do otherwise. So I think
the first. Sorry, please, Jamie, you go.
No, you go.
I was going to say one of the first, just on the point about that, the laziness point that you mentioned, that critique. The first TEDx event I went to in Glasgow was 2014 at the RSA next door to Citizen M, and I was lucky enough to see Catherine Trebek that day, but also Sir Harry Burns. I'm not sure if you were there or you've seen the talk since, but honestly, that was a moment I will never forget, seeing Sir Harry talk about wellness and alienation. And I think that's often something I see and hear talked about in this context as well. And so the concept of alienation, folks, is really where, as human beings, there's a desire that we have within us to do meaningful things and meaningful work. And if you have an opportunity, go watch Sir Harry Burns' talk from 2016. But he talks about the malaise in the East End of Glasgow and why there was a greater incidence of sickness and people took longer to heal in the East End of Glasgow. And as they looked into what was the cause, it wasn't medical. It was eventually, as he got down to it, it was that deep-rooted lack of purpose, lack of a reason to get up in the morning. And Jimmy Reid talked about that in his famous university speech. So how do those two sit hand in hand, Jamie, the basic income, and then how do we ensure that people don't feel alienated from society?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, we first and foremost, I think it's always important to re-emphasize that basic income is not a magic bullet that solves every problem. A basic income is a space, a foundation for me, a foundation to a new social contract. So it's a way that we reset the relationship between citizens and states, the expectations and the connection we have to each other. It allows us to start to look again at, Beveridge's giants that helped drive the post-war consensus and welfare states creation. The giants haven't gone away, but they've evolved. The issue is we haven't evolved with them in terms of our responses. So basic income can't solve all these on itself, but by giving people security and trust, you model, in a sense, as a society, how you view people, what you think of them. If you view people with distrust, if you view people as commodities, if you view people as people who have to be forced to jump through hoops to deliver certain outcomes, then they will behave in that way, and it will have that impact, particularly over a long period of time. If you start to give them trust and space, people respond to that. There was a very misreported experiment that was carried out in Finland fairly recently. So it was a couple of years, 2,000 people were receiving unemployment benefit. It was changed to a basic income. So effectively, they received the same amount of money. The only difference was there were no conditions attached. Previously, it was similar to the UK. They had to demonstrate looking for work and so on. Now they just received the money every month. They could keep it if they moved into work. They kept it if they weren't in work. And the research, and you can go into Kela, which is the Finnish Social Security website. I'll be very happy to share links again afterwards. It might be of interest to people. The analysis interestingly showed that there hadn't been a negative impact on working, which had been one of the attacks. Actually, there was a slight improvement in work, but actually the big impact was in self-reported well-being. People felt trusted. Their trust in the state and in their communities actually rose by participating. And I think this is the critical aspects, because it allows people also to change and to challenge this very concept of work. So, when you're talking about people want to have that impact, they want to do something with their life. To me, work is a space to do that when it's an empowering, positive, multifaceted concept. Work for us is employment to an employer, and is 9 to 5, bringing in your income, doing X, Y, and Z, which actually has become harder and harder to find. And I think that's partly why basic income has risen up the political agendas, because as we see gig economy and automation and AI and changing facets of work come in, but also it's because of this disconnect. People want to live their lives in productive, positive ways, and actually some of that will be in employment and some of that will be in other ways, and a basic income starts to allow that space. And I think, for me, a lot of the time we lose. So I find when I talk about basic income, quite often at the end of it, someone will call me a communist and someone will call me an evil Thatcherite trying to destroy society. So I figure that's usually doing pretty well. But for me, it's not a concept of pushing consumerism or libertarianism. I've never really understood the dichotomy between individuals or states, because actually our society, because we are a society which has individuals and communities within it. And I think this gives that balance back. But I always remember being really struck. We published a report last year on the basic income for Scotland, and we worked in Fife with some groups there. And I remember talking to a lady who came along, and the groups were just amazing. The generosity of their sharing was just so inspiring, and the horrors of their experiences within the current system. But we were talking about what would you do if you had a basic income, and some great answers. And I remember one of the participants said, "I'm really sorry," she said, "to say this, and I know it's not what you're wanting, and don't feel free not to include it in any reports or anything else." She said, "But if I'm being honest, one of the things I would do if I had a basic income is that every so often I'd buy a Chinese takeaway on a Friday night for me and the family to share." And she was almost ashamed to say it, because it was this idea of you should be doing, going to university and starting your own business and stuff, all of which are, hopefully great outcomes. But actually in that, there was something around giving somebody that chance. Now, again, we're not necessarily encouraging takeaways all the time. Hopefully it leads to healthy eating as well. But I just thought there was such a powerful reminder to us that we've kind of stigmatized choices, and particularly choices for different parts of communities. So I think by giving that security, by giving people that space to step back and breathe. People talk a lot about mental bandwidth. So when you have, and interestingly, I think the COVID pandemic has forced a lot of us who maybe don't live in conditions of poverty to experience that mental bandwidth, because I think the entire lockdown experience has kind of crammed us all in, both literatively and figuratively, and has reduced some of our mental space and capacity. When you don't have that, when you're trying to survive, it's very difficult to look at those wider connections because you're just trying to make it through. And I think by giving people that security and space, you allow the natural connectivity of humans to flourish. And I think that is one of the ways that you have to build and contribute to that well-being and that wellness that's absolutely critical to everything we want to achieve in society.
Right, and thank you for sharing that story, because I think there's a lovely bit of humanity about that. Something that many of us on this call certainly will take for granted, the ability to have a takeaway. But for some people, that's just, it's not even in their sphere of being. And so if we can do that, it gives people that just sense of self. I think that's a wonderful thing to do. I was really struck by the report on Fife, and I went back and had a look at it over the last week ahead of this call today. And maybe we just stay in that space for a moment or two. But what really struck me, Jamie, was that the significant improvement in some of the key measures that you looked at in Fife, one around deprivation. And I think an annual basic income of £2,500, which again, to all of us on this call, doesn't sound like a great deal of money, but that was making a significant improvement in deprivation in Fife.
It's actually for Scotland as a whole. So we proposed, so we used the 3 horizons model that International Futures Forum uses. So kind of where you are now, third horizon where you would ideally like to be, and then a kind of interim measure in the middle. And so that 2,500 annual per adult was the interim measure that we felt could be delivered in Scotland, with some caveats in the sense it does require UK government involvement, but within one parliamentary term. The bigger level, which was £4,800 per adult, would take a bit longer to improve, but we're both utterly deliverable. I mean, the 4,500 under our economic modelling eliminates destitution under Joseph Rowntree Foundation's measures in Scotland entirely, and reduces poverty by a third. Even the interim measure, yes, has a significant, reduces deprivation by half, and has significant impact on particularly child poverty. And we were, to be honest, and I'm not an economist, I'm not an economic modeler. We've worked with some very talented people. But we were very surprised by the scale of the impact at such a low level. And it's worth saying these were models that they're not necessarily the models that we feel society should be bound to. At the end of the day, there's political and economic decisions to all of them. They're broadly in keeping with most models that have been proposed for Scotland, so by the Scottish Green Party, Reform Scotland, and others. But we wanted to show something that was deliverable, that could be paid for, to outline some of the costs that it could carry. So even the higher level, I think it's about £9 billion a year for Scotland. So they are deliverable. But also that we were surprised by the scale of that impact. And I think fundamentally, the critical part of that comes back to the role of that unconditionality, the fact that you can then start to move in and out of paid employment and other opportunities that starts to have a profound impact. And that's just, none of the modelling that we had in it was able to take into account behavioural impacts. This was purely economic impact. So, I would very strongly suggest that the wider impacts and the longer term impacts would be more significant again. But as an opportunity to say this is something that a small country like Scotland could and should be looking at, I think it was very, very powerful to be able to start to see those impacts.
One of the obvious questions, I think, and I'm sure you hear this all of the time, is how do we pay for this? It's a great idea. We've just talked about how that small amount of money can make a huge impact in terms of destitution and poverty, and take people out of that environment altogether. How do we pay for this?
I think first thing I would say is that I think it's critical we see there are different approaches you could take to a basic income. And so there's an approach to a basic income that I would, as someone who spends far too much of my time in life, boring everyone who meets me, talking about this and working on it. There are versions of basic income that I would fight tooth and nail if they were ever tried to be implemented. So particularly there's kind of, you don't see it as much in the UK, but particularly in the US, a kind of libertarian approach that says, well, actually, they tend to give a very generous basic income. but we'll do that by scrapping education and health to pay for it. So, I mean, first and foremost, we are looking at basic income within the context of social security, not the wider welfare state. So this is alongside and on top of the NHS and education, for example. But also it's an investment in society. We invest in businesses, we invest in structures, we invest in infrastructure. This is all important. Why don't we invest in our people? And actually, I think we shouldn't necessarily be starting from a point of looking at how do you make this cost neutral, because actually the longer term impacts on health, on employment, on new business creation, for example, will be significant. And that's where you invest that money in your people. Also, I think COVID has really challenged that question. And you're right, it's one that's brought up most often, is how do we find money? Well, it's amazing. We find money when we need it. And, I think the current levels of borrowing and spending in the UK and across the, most economies has really shown up the fact that a lot of decisions around restricting funding are political decisions. And you can argue whether they're right or wrong, sensible or otherwise, but they are political decisions. Within the modelling, we suggested, for example, a UK-wide basic income, basic opportunity fund, we called it. So it wasn't straight to basic income, but basically over a 10-year period, everyone in the UK would have access to effectively a basic income for 2 out of those 10 years. And so it almost combined a massive UK-wide 10-year pilot with also an immediate intervention. And then you could roll it out or scale it up with it. I mean, those kind of changes, the costs that we were talking about with that are virtually identical, if not less, than most changes to corporation tax that have been brought in the UK in recent years. So the money is not insurmountable anyway. But also, I think there's a critical question around funding. And this is where, the basic income movement, discussion space, whatever you want to call it, of course, there's diversity of views there. And I suppose traditionally, a lot of the approach of funding basic income was, well, you pay for it by income tax raises. And if you don't, then it's by cutting services. And, the basic income feasibility study that was carried out in Scotland, that published its report earlier this year, really important piece of work. The modelling that was attached to that from the Fraser Valander Centre, is obviously incredibly detailed and well done, as you would expect from them. But it's all carried out within where we are. And so it goes back to income tax rises or public spending cuts. To me, if one of the fundamental drivers of discussing basic income is because society has changed, work is changing, the economy is changing, the world is changing, then we have to change where we raise money as well. And so the day's income tax, of course, is a part of it. But where are the new revenue streams that we need to be looking at? Huge one has to be around data. Arguably the biggest resource in the 21st century. Most of it, if not all of it, flowing past us, from us, into private pockets. It's interesting that a lot of the big tech companies are very interested in basic income. If I'm being cynical, I'm sure some of them, it's motivation by a desire to make the world a better place. Being slightly cynical, for some of them, it's also a degree of self-preservation, because I think there's a recognition either that their technologies will have an impact on people's lives, and they're not too keen on the idea of pitchforks at the door. And so maybe this is a way to address some of that. And also, I think a recognition that the financial benefits they're gaining from data are huge. And actually, if we ever chose to really gain value from those, it would have quite an impact on their bottom line. So I think we have to be looking at areas like that, potentials like land valuation tax, climate change taxation, areas like this that bring into play. If we're looking at a new world and this is a system for it to reset the foundation of our social contract, we also need to be looking at our taxation system in general. And if we close some of the loopholes, you'll know this far better than me, but if we could close some of the loopholes around large companies and individuals who manage to circumvent current tax systems, then maybe that would find some of our money as well. So I think there's a range of opportunities there. And I think for me, it should be a driver of a big conversation around, well, actually, how do we invest in people and fund the kind of things we do?
And I think there's a couple of other things there. I watched another TED talk a couple of days ago. Rutger Bregman, I'm sure you've seen his talks, an actual TED talk from the main conference. And there's a couple of things he said in his TED talk which really struck me. One was that poverty is hugely expensive. and actually the costs of poverty to a nation. This is an American example. He quoted a figure of $500 billion as an annual cost to the US of poverty, and actually looked at what it would cost to introduce a basic income, and that figure was 175 billion. And so the net, and yeah, as you said earlier, lots of different models, lots of different versions, but that really struck me as something. The other thing he said, which comes back to something you said a moment ago, was that he said basic income is venture capital for the people. And to your point of investing in people, and I think that those are things we really need to think about. One of the things I found this summer with the weekly podcast that Matthew's been producing, and that you've hosted a number of those events as well, is that I've ended up buying a great deal of books, huge number of books. And one of the books that I picked up earlier this year, I have it behind me here, was this, and I know Andrew Ferguson's probably on this, called Impact by Sir Ronald Cohen. And this was a really fascinating book, Reshaping Capitalism to Drive Real Change. And so many of the projects that he talks about in the book are investments in not traditional business investment, but investment into systems, into organizations that will improve them and improve the benefit to society. And there's some fascinating financial models in here that, to your point about, we need to rethink our taxation systems or how we generate revenue. And I like most of these books I've bought, I get about halfway through, then there's another one and I buy it, and another one and I buy it. So I will finish it. But Andrew has finished it and said it fundamentally changed how he thinks about things. And so looking at systems and revenue generation in a completely different way has to be something that we do differently going forward, Jamie.
100%. I haven't read that book, so I'll now add it to my list of books to pick up. No, 100%. And I mean, you're talking there about, you know, the poverty costs, and so there's almost that way that you can step back and you can, you know, there's a very moral drive to basic income. And actually, what I would say is one of the big differences between, say, the basic income discussion in the US, which, you know, is again massively surged. So fantastic work by campaigners like Scott Santons, who people might have seen on Twitter and so on. Scott's done a really great work in kind of popularizing a lot of that. But also, I suppose the real big push was around a combination of Andrew Yang running for the Democratic nomination with the, in true American style, freedom dividends as his central plank of his campaign. But I think Andrew did a great job of bringing that to the masses. And, you know, by the end of what was in a sense a shame, if you liked his thinking, a shame that his campaign came to a close quite an early stage, was that already by then the polling was showing that the majority of Democrat voters were in favour of basic income, who had previously not heard of it. And we see that we've had that polling in Scotland as well. As people get engaged with the idea, support seems to inevitably rise. As you said, it seems quite a no-brainer. But also the fact that they've started some experiments, you know, in Stockton, California. There's now mayors for guaranteed income across the US who are looking at this. But in the US, a lot of the drivers have been, yes, around impacts of poverty in specific communities, but actually have been around automation, artificial intelligence, the concept of looming impact on jobs. You know, I think off the top of my head, it's something like 35. If you haven't read it, Andrew Yang's book, The War on Normal People, is really interesting. If nothing else, combination of facts and figures about the US. But something like 35 of the US states, long distance truck driving is still the biggest source of employment for white men. And you can see that it's going to vanish. I mean, I don't subscribe fully to the idea that, you know, jobs are going to vanish as we know them. I don't see basic income as a post-work policy, but actually as a good work policy. But I think you can certainly see certain areas where it's going to be devastating, and as we so often see on communities who have already experienced a lot of that before. So the driver there has been probably primarily economic and work focused. In Scotland, the driver has been primarily social justice. How do we create a fairer society? You know, talking to people in, say, a community in a city like Glasgow, will say, well, look, we've had well-meaning politicians try the same things for 50 years and it hasn't changed. Now's the time to try something different. And actually, I think what we need is that combination of the two, because a friend of mine who's very involved in the discussion in Wales talked about the fact that you know, automation is an issue of social justice because of the communities that are partly going to be hit by it, even if the impacts will be wider across society. But also then COVID has happened. And what we've seen with COVID is if we had come into this pandemic, and the warning to us is this won't be the last one. So this is our, again, not to downplay the horrific impacts of this pandemic, it could have been worse. And, you know, we've had warning shots before and ignored them. This is a pretty significant one. Had we come into this with a basic income in place, we could have dealt with a lot of the early impacts much easier. We wouldn't have been scrambling as suddenly the universal credit system was overloaded with new applicants, as a lot of self-employed people, as you well know, fell through cracks or weren't supported, as systems delayed people, you know, sometimes cynically in a deliberate purpose and sometimes not. You know, having a basic income there means that you are prepared for these shocks to the system as well. So poverty costs, but so does not being prepared for many of the challenges we face. And I think it goes back to, therefore, this investment idea. You're building the social infrastructure that creates us, and the systems that creates a much stronger, more resilient society for future and for the shocks that come, whether that's economic and or natural phenomenon, as we've sadly experienced over the last year.
Conscious of our time, Jamie, it's been a very, very quick 45 minutes nearly now. And one final question, and it's perhaps the most difficult question, you'll find out from you in a moment, but what's it going to take to make universal basic income a thing, an actual event in our lifetimes here in the UK?
So I think that's a really interesting question. I think it has different levels to it. So apart from anything, I think the COVID discussion has brought the space forward by about 5 years, give or take. So going into, we've seen rapid change. You know, I first got involved in basic income in 2016. My colleague Anthony had written our first report at the end of 2015. I must admit at the time, didn't really know much about it. Saw it as a useful provocation on the failings in the system, but not one that I thought was realistic or deliverable. We had a lecture with our Angus Miller lecture, a big annual Scottish RSA Scotland lecture with Guy Standing, one of the leading lights in the field. And that really kick-started. So we went from 2016, where Fife Council had been looking at basic income, nobody else really. You know, some great thinkers in Scotland, late economist Ailsa Mackay had been a leading proponent. The Green Party had been looking at it for years, but not really in common discourse. You fast forward to 2017, and by this point, we'd started to work with some of the local authorities. Glasgow were on board, Edinburgh, North Ayrshire, Fife. And I was over in the US, in Pittsburgh, which is a whole other area of passion for me in terms of the relationship between Glasgow and Pittsburgh. But I remember kind of giving a talk or a session there and saying, like, one thing you won't see, I was asked a similar question as you've asked, one thing you won't see is the Scottish Government publicly showing interest, because they can't deliver it. Scotland does not have the power or capacity to deliver a basic income. We have about, 15% of social security. We cannot do it. It has to involve UK government. And the Scottish Government will not get involved because they'll just be accused of, why are you looking at utopian ideas that you can't deliver? That was the Tuesday. I went to bed, woke up on the Wednesday morning to an email from the First Minister's office saying, great news, programme for government this afternoon. We're going to announce $250,000 for a feasibility study into basic income experiments in Scotland. So it clearly showed how well I could read the political environment. Of course, tried to just take full credit for it. But, you know, as we were heading into the pandemic, we had a situation where in Scotland, you had interest. Nicola Sturgeon wrote an article in The Economist a couple of years ago talking about, you know, the fact that she was interested in experiments, but it was very much quite sensibly, interesting idea. Let's see what it could mean. You know, people like Harry Burns, you'd mentioned, others were stronger supporters, but, you know, it was very much as a testable idea, an exploring idea. The pandemic has completely changed the dynamic of that. You know, the First Minister is now regularly and publicly stating that basic income is an idea whose time has come that she wants to deliver. Now, again, you could argue she can't deliver it, so it's you know, one thing to be able to say that in public if you can't do it. But I think it shifted the debate in Scotland, and I think you know, if polling stands up as it looks just now, I expect after the Scottish parliamentary elections next year that the majority of MSPs will be in favour of basic income in some capacity at least. You know, and we're seeing interest developing across the political spectrum as well. So this is very much developing into a cross-party, different angles, but, you know, cross-party interest there. The UK government are opposed to basic income as it stands. They've looked at it a couple of times and they've refused. There was some push within Tory ranks down south to look at an emergency basic income at the beginning of the pandemic, but the Chancellor and the UK government have resisted it. But interest is growing in England as well. The north of England in particular, there's been several cities have expressed interest, Liverpool and others, also in the south, Brighton. Northern Ireland, we've now had several, and the Welsh government are very interested. So I think in terms of what will happen, I think if we do head into a period of a second independence referendum in Scotland, I would expect basic income to be a part of that discussion. I think you can see how there's an argument to be made for independence as a starting point. Basic income as a new starting point if you were starting as an independent country. But within a UK system, there are also arguments to be made about how you could deliver a basic income within that as well. It would require change, but it could be delivered. I wonder on a UK level, obviously we may see significant political changes as Brexit starts to hit, or we may not. But I suspect that maybe in some ways the UK government's opposition is not necessarily as rigid as it would appear at points. I think they've invested in and they're committed to universal credit, but I think as universal credit, sadly, I think hurtles towards its inevitable decline, then there will be needs to look at other opportunities. So I think I could see in Scotland us making potentially greater speed than other parts of the UK just now. But I think that the shift has been in Scotland from the idea of the experiments being the focus to actual policy. How could you actually implement this and what would it look like and mean for Scotland? And I think that's, in 2016, when I first got involved in this, if you told me at this point we'd be at that stage, I would have been quite surprised. So I think it shows the relevance, the resonance and the opportunity of it. And maybe we'll see it develop in stages. Maybe we'll see it come in a more targeted way to start with, which is not the ideal, but maybe gives us steps into it. But I think certainly the momentum is there. And I think the critical bit, as we've talked about before, is there's been this opportunity to challenge the paradigms that exist. More people have suddenly experienced universal credit and realized it's not this wonderful system that's being misused by slackers and cheats. It's actually a system that is not fit for purpose. And I think that environment's there. And I suppose for all of us, whether you agree with basic income being the answer or not, I think basic income certainly asks a lot of the critical questions. And it's then about how do we use this moment in time to try and drive change and create a fairer, more equitable and more resilient social structure and social contract for Scotland and the UK and beyond as we move forward.
Jamie, you've given us a great deal to think about today. It's been an absolute pleasure to have the chance to talk to you. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us on this today. If anybody wants to continue the conversation, follow you online, what's the best forum for people to do that?
So I use Twitter far too much, so you can get me on there at Jamie A. Cooke with an E at the end. Very happy, I can pass on my details, and I'm very happy for you to share them in terms of email and so on. And again, so you can send through resources. There's stuff in the RSA webpage around basic income, so you can get the reports we've written. You mentioned TEDx talk from a few years ago. I'd love to get to do another one just because you can update it after a few years, couldn't you? Because it was very much a different point we did. But yeah, some really interesting stuff online. Look at people like BN, which is Basic Income Earth Network, or Basic Income Network Scotland. Again, they're a really great way to get involved. And I think one thing I would flag up is that in August next year, 2021, the World Basic Income Congress is going to be coming to Glasgow. So we secured that, and it'll be hosted at Strathclyde University. So the hope is there will be in-person part of it. It may just be that we expect people in Scotland to be there, hopefully, but there's a lot of global interest. But there'll also be online aspects, and it would be fantastic to engage with as much discussion in Scotland around that, to really drive that space of, well, what could this look like in reality and what could the impact be?
Sounds fantastic. We'll keep an eye out for that, Jamie. Thanks once again so much for joining us. We'll see everyone again in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.